In the 4th millennium BC, one of the earliest civilizations of the world was developing in the river valleys of the Indian subcontinent. The first sites of this civilization were discovered in the basin of the Indus River. The name Indus Valley Civilization has remained.
I really think that next to Gandhi's struggle for independence from the British Empire, this probably was the most remarkable period in history. And this happened about 5,000 years ago.
This was a highly developed culture with a sophisticated concept of town planning.
But there were certainly skilled, well-trained engineers. And you see this when you just look at the towns, the way the towns are laid out, very systematic, with broad avenues for major traffics between the gates, for example, and then smaller roads branching off the major avenues, and then alleys finally getting deep into the blocks where people live.
More than 4,000 seals, probably used for the purpose of trade, have been found. They combine finely made images of animals with text. Unlike other cultures of that period, the art here does not have any representations of warfare, war memorials, or of prisoners. This is the only civilization where archaeology has not unearthed evidence of weapons of war or barracks for any army or police. Historians are also fascinated that all evidence points to a thriving cooperative system and not a conventional kingship.
The archaeology is quite clear about the fact that there were weapons that were used for hunting, but there were no large numbers of weapons as all of the other contemporary civilizations had at that time. Earlier, we don't have any army or police forces. They would require barracks. There are no barracks. They would require weapons, and there are no weapons.
One of the most fascinating seals from Mohenjo-daro is that with a depiction of a man seated in a posture quite like yoga. Yoga is an essential aspect of the spiritual life of India till today. By the 8th or the 9th century BC, the Upanishads were composed out of the early philosophic traditions of the land. The thoughts contained in the Upanishads were to form the basis of all major Indic faiths thereafter. This is a view of the world which sees a harmony in the whole of creation. It sees the same which is in each of us, in the animals, the flowers, and the trees. All that there is seen to be a part of the One. The phenomenal world of separated beings and objects seen around us is considered to be an illusion, perceived and brought to us by our limited senses. The high purpose in life is to seek reintegration with the One, to see oneself as a part of the divinity of existence, and thereby to lose the pain of a life caught in the web of endless desires. In this period, there were large numbers of ascetics who gave up the material attractions of the world to seek the truth beyond. The names of two historical renunciators of this tradition became most prominent: Gautama Buddha and Mahavira. Both taught the philosophy of the Upanishadic age, and there are striking similarities in their teachings. In later times, the followers of these teachers formed large religious groups which continue till today as two of the great religions of the world with millions of followers: Buddhism and Jainism.
They all take from a common tradition ideas such as the belief in samsara, the belief in dharma and a dharmic way, and the need to lead one's life in a certain way in this world, so that eventually one can be released, gain moksha, and be released from the cycle of rebirth.
Since earliest historic times, the kings and the people of this land presented a unique and fascinating culture. The earliest Indic inscriptions we can read are of Emperor Ashoka's period in the 3rd century BC. Following the example of the Achaemenid Persians, he made inscriptions on pillars and edicts on rocks. But that is where the similarity ends. While the Persian kings made extensive statements about their personal glory, valor, conquests, titles, and dynasties, Ashoka does not even mention his own name in most of his edicts. He is just referred to as Devanampiya Piyadasi, beloved of the divine, and one whose vision is filled with adoration. These inscriptions of the 3rd century BC are a remarkable record of a compassionate and cosmopolitan vision, a vision which has not been surpassed by any ruler till today. He says, "His Sacred Majesty does reverence to men of all sects. A man must not do reverence only to his own sect, while disparaging the sects of others."
Within his edicts, he is very clear about not actually saying that, look at me, I'm a Buddhist, therefore, we will have Buddhist principles in my empire. Instead, he constantly talks, as you say, about the dharma and about the right way of living.
It is only by taking interest in other people's religion that one is serving dharma.
Emperor Ashoka's inscriptions show that he visited many Buddhist pilgrimage sites. However, the great caves which were excavated out of the hills of Barabar in Bihar in his time and that of his grandson Dashratha were for the ascetic sect of Ajivikas. We find from here onwards, for at least the next 1,000 years, a fluid tradition in which members of the same family freely worshipped and patronized the stupas and temples of the Buddhist, Jaina and Hindu faiths.
One of the things that we have to be careful about is to not think in terms of the fixed and rigid religious categories and religious boundaries that we are so familiar with today.
It seems that throughout history, the ordinary householder has been willing to show his generosity to more than one religious order or faith.
But there is plenty of evidence from inscriptions indicating that people, whether it is ordinary people and more so members of royal families, especially kings, did extend patronage towards religious establishments of different denominations.
The earliest surviving Buddhist art of the world are the sculpted railings of stupas in the 2nd century BC. Ashoka's pillars had only images which were common to all faiths, such as the chakra, which stands for cosmic order. The Bharut stupa railings, originally in central India, bring us for the first time specific Buddhist themes, including Jataka stories. These were made under the rule of the Shunga kings, who personally worshipped Hindu deities. Similarly, at Sanchi, also in central India, sculpted railings were made around a stupa in the 2nd century BC. They present Buddhist themes and were made under the rule of benevolent Shunga kings who worshipped Hindu deities. In the 1st century AD, under the rule of the Satavahana kings, great entrance gateways were made to the large stupa in Sanchi. These continued Buddhist themes. Inscriptions show that the Satavahana rulers followed Hindu deities and were fully generous to the Buddhist Sangha. It is significant that at least the first 600 years of surviving Buddhist art was all created under the rule of kings who worshipped Hindu deities. The deities seen most often in the Buddhist and Jaina monuments of the period are yakshas and yakshis. These embody the spirit of nature and serve to remind us of the divinity which underlies all that is around us. The first formalized deity seen in Buddhist and Jaina art is Gajalakshmi, Lakshmi with elephants who shower water upon her. Like the Yakshi, she also represents the bountiful abundance of nature. Lakshmi continues till today in Hindu worship and in Buddhist worship in Japan and other countries.
Today we are surprised at the fact that they have so many things in common, but it is because we are looking at these as religions. But we have to be aware of the fact that these so-called religions, the Hindu, Buddhist and Jain religions, have been they're a construct, they're a colonial construct that was created by people who were writing, the colonial scholars who were writing about these faiths.
There are no gods in the early philosophic vision of India. There are deities, deities who are the personifications of concepts and qualities. The qualities are within us, and by responding to these deities brought to us in art, we awaken those fine aspects. In ancient India, people were free to adore the deity of their personal choice. Within families, husbands, wives and children often followed the path of different deities.
It's a misconception that many people think these images of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are the representation of the gods. No. But they are the deities. Deities means one of the aspects of the Chetsikas and Chitta, because it's a consciousness, no? It's a factor of one of the consciousnesses. No? So they are not truly existing.
Where we find, for example, that in a Buddhist temple, while the principal deity, the object of worship would be Buddha, but the scheme of sculptures in the temple as a whole would also show Hindu gods like Indra or Agni being depicted. It is only the degree of importance given to different deities which changes in different religions.
In Western India, the 2nd century BC ushered in one of the greatest periods of the entire art of Buddhism. Over a period of about 1,000 years, more than 1,200 caves were hewn out of the mountains of the Western Ghats. The first phase of prolific excavation was from the 2nd century BC till the 3rd century AD. Great Buddhist prayer halls and viharas for the residence of monks were made under the rule of the Satavahanas and the Kshatrapas. Though these kings revered Hindu deities, they patronized all religious establishments. The Buddhist cave number 18 at Bhaja of the 2nd century BC brings us some of the earliest known representations of the Hindu deities Indra and Surya. They continue in worship till today in Hinduism and in Buddhist temples in Japan. A Gana of the 2nd century BC, made at the Buddhist site of Pitalkhora, carries an inscription which states that he was the donation of a goldsmith, Kanhadasa, which means servant of Krishna, a Hindu deity. One of the grandest Buddhist caves is the great Chaitya at Karle of the 1st century AD. Inscriptions record the names of numerous individual donors who paid for the carving of various parts of the cave and its pillars. These include Greeks. In fact, many Greeks and Romans visited and even settled in India during this period of flourishing trade. Many of them are known to have become devout followers of Indic faiths. Among the earliest known Hindu antiquities is the Heliodorus pillar at Vidisha in Madhya Pradesh of the 2nd century BC. The inscription on it states that it was set up by a Greek devotee by that name, in honor of Vasudeva, or Lord Vishnu.
The inscription dated around 150 AD, found at Nasik, inscription issued by one Gautami Balashri, who was the mother of a Satavahan ruler, Gautami Putra. She praises him for the worship for devotion to gods like Krishna and Balarama. But the purpose of the inscription is to donate an excavated cave to the Buddhist monastic order. But more than that, there are hundreds of inscriptions in the Western Ghats issued during the period of Satavahan rule, which record donations of people from various classes of life to the Buddhist monastic order. So, it is obvious that though the rulers had their religious preferences, there was no pressure on the population to follow the religion of the ruler.
The only deities in early Indian art were Yakshas, Yakshis, Nagas and Lakshmi. There were no figures made of Buddha, Jaina Tirthankaras or Hindu deities. These came to be made for the first time in the 1st century AD under the rule of the Kushanas, whose homeland was in southern China. The inscriptions show that the Kushana rulers worshipped Hindu deities themselves. However, in keeping with the Indic traditions, they were fully benevolent to Buddhist and Jaina establishments. The fertile valley of the Krishna River was the cradle of civilization in the eastern Deccan. This area became one of the greatest centers of Buddhism, and over 140 early Buddhist sites have been listed in this region. The exquisite phase of the art of the Amravati stupa was under the rule of the Satvahana rulers. They were devoted to Hindu deities and were fully benevolent to the Buddhist Sangha. The Ikshvakus came to power in the Krishna Valley in the 2nd quarter of the 3rd century. A large number of monastic establishments were founded at Nagarjunakonda for the residence, study and worship of at least 4 different sects of Buddhists. As in the case of all major Buddhist monuments since the 2nd century BC, these at Nagarjunakonda were made under the rule of kings who worshipped Hindu deities themselves. As was often the case, some female members of the royal family were devoted to Buddhism and made personal donations to the monasteries. The period of Gupta rule in North India brings some of the finest and best-known Buddhist, Hindu and Jaina art. It is significant to note that many of the kings personally followed Hindu practices. However, some of the greatest Buddhist art of the world was made in their benevolent rule. Records also show that these kings gave very generous grants for Buddhist establishments. In fact, the most vibrant and important centers of Buddhist thought and worship reached their height during Gupta rule. These were the wondrous University of Nalanda and the Mahabodhi temple at Bodh Gaya. These were described as the center of the Buddhist world by the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang in the 7th century. We also find wonderful Jaina images whose inscriptions state that they were made under the rule of Hindu kings, such as Ramagupta, named after the Hindu deity Rama. Some of the finest Hindu art at Aaron and other sites was made under the rule of a king named Buddhagupta.
If you look at the material remains of ancient religious shrines, monasteries, one of the things that becomes very apparent is that there was a very large pool of shared symbols, shared imagery that becomes very apparent when you look at the sculptural motifs at these sites.
At the magnificent site of Ajanta, in the horseshoe-shaped gorge of the Waghora River, great shrines and monasteries had been carved out of the heart of the mountain in the 2nd century BC. This was in the rule of the Hindu Satavahana kings. In the mid-5th century, under the rule of the Hindu Vakataka kings, it saw renewed activity. As in the Indic tradition seen earlier in the western and eastern Deccan, feudatories, ministers of the king, and even queens freely followed the Buddhist faith. They also patronized Buddhist caves and art. There were no religious divisions, and the patrons of the Buddhist caves sometimes proclaimed their descent from Hindu deities. Until this period, there is no inscription that directly attributes the making of temples or caves and their art to a ruler. In the subsequent art of the Chalukyas of the 6th to 8th centuries, we find a continuation of such traditions. Magnificent caves and temples were made and dedicated by members of the royal family. However, there are none made by the kings. This is a unique phenomenon of ancient Indian art and history. Rulers patronized the monuments of all faiths through the grants of the revenues of villages and by other means. However, they did not directly make or dedicate such edifices or art of any faith.
There is another inscription, the Aiholi inscription of the Chalukya ruler, Pulakeshin II. It is a panegyric of the ruler by one of his officials, which praises him for his upholding of the Brahmanical religious tradition, etc. But the author of the inscription, or the one who got it engraved, is a Jain, and the inscription begins with a salutation to the Jaina prophets, and then it goes. So, quite obviously, there wasn't, I mean, neither the official nor the ruler perhaps saw their interests being in conflict with each other.
So, we are looking at something that has to do with mutual understanding and concord, ideas that the word tolerance really does absolutely no justice to.
The understanding of the interrelatedness of the whole of creation remained the underlying belief and the theme of art in India. The sense of love and duty towards all that there is seen in inscriptions throughout the ancient period. The most common wish in donation inscriptions is for the benefit of all sentient beings. A 5th century inscription at Ajanta translates, "The joy of giving filled him so much that it left no space for the feeling of pain. In ancient times, many Buddhist pilgrims from China made the long and arduous journey to India to visit holy places. Among them was Xuanzang in the 7th century AD. Like Fa Hien of the 4th century AD and others, Xuanzang wrote enthusiastic accounts of his travels in India. These are written from a religious pilgrim's point of view. Nevertheless, they provide much information about ancient India. The traveller was greatly impressed by King Harsha of the 7th century. Owing to the ruler's generous patronage of Buddhist establishments, he describes him as a great Buddhist king. However, King Harsha's own inscriptions show that he was a devout Hindu worshipper. Harsha's dramas written on Buddhist ethics are performed in Japan till today. When Xuanzang visited the Nalanda University in the 7th century, he found that the courses of study there included Sanskrit grammar, Buddhist philosophy, Hindu shastras and sutras, the Vedas, arithmetic and the sciences. Such was the cosmopolitan culture continuing from the earliest times in the Indian subcontinent. The Palas ruled in eastern India from the 8th to the 12th centuries. This period saw the greatest heights in the development of Buddhist logic. Many vast universities flourished and spread their influence to the other countries of Asia.
Fascinating to imagine this period in the year 800 or 1000 when Buddhist monks and scholars from Sumatra in Indonesia or Java in Indonesia or from Cambodia or from Tibet would be coming to Bihar, to the Bodh Gaya area, to go to the Buddhist universities and the great famous monasteries in that area to learn, to study, to debate points of religious doctrine. And the communication must have been going on in Sanskrit. These foreign scholars certainly would have had to learn Sanskrit to read the ancient Buddhist texts.
We see in a copper plate inscription that King Narayan Pala of the 9th century established a most impressive Shiva temple and donated the revenue of a village for its priests. Buddhists and Jainas also flourished in this period. Official seals of the Pala kings bear the Buddhist emblem of the Dharma Chakra. It is in Pala times that Tantric philosophy developed equally in Buddhist and Hindu streams. In the late 8th or early 9th century AD, a great monastic university was founded by King Dharmapala at Vikramshila in Bihar. The philosophy of Vajrayana Buddhism was developed to its greatest heights here, and its teachers were invited to faraway lands. King Dharmapala also donated large amounts of money for the excavation of holy tanks in Hindu temples. Inscriptions show that many kings of the Pala dynasty followed the path of the Buddha.
They also show that several others of the same dynasty followed other faiths. Best of all, the same kings are clearly seen to be equally generous to Hindus and Buddhists. King Mahipala I of the 11th century is described in his copperplate inscription as Parama Sangata, respectful to the Buddha. An inscription of the king also shows that he was a follower of the Shaiva ascetic Vanavasi. Other inscriptions state that he patronized Shaiva ascetics and donated a vast monastery for them.
I think one of the things that is clear is that these things were not considered as mutually exclusive, and that's where certainly I think we're dealing with a situation in which it was not considered inappropriate or odd or awkward in any way if a ruler or a queen or a princess, or I would say even an ordinary person, gave a gift, made a pious gift towards a Buddhist monastery, and at the same time made a gift towards building a Brahminical temple. So this does tell us a great deal about religious boundaries being relatively fluid in those times. And certainly I think the fact that we find this kind of phenomenon surprising at all is because we are looking at the ancient past through the eyes of the present and from the point of view of clearly defined, mutually exclusive religious boundaries.
In this gallery there are sculptures from Bihar and Bengal from about the 8th century up till the 12th century, and on one side of the room are Buddhist sculptures and the other are Hindu. And there's every reason to think that the same workshops and perhaps even the same artists were creating these sculptures either for Buddhist use or for Hindu use. And I also think it's perfectly possible that some of the patrons were commissioning Buddhist images for certain occasions and Hindu images for other occasions.
In the spiritual climate which continued from ancient times, we see that in the early medieval period, there were no boundaries between faiths. The same person is most often described as a devotee of different deities, depending upon the occasion. Examples of this are numberless. Such religious divisions are a later construct by scholars who have tried to understand Indian history from a vastly different perspective. The valley of Kashmir was one of the great centers of Buddhist and Hindu philosophy. The site of Parihaspura in Kashmir of the 8th century has a Buddhist chaitya as well as a Hindu Vishnu temple, both dedicated by King Lalitaditya. In that cosmopolitan culture, the same site also has a vast stupa made by the king's Tokharian minister. There is a vast body of mural paintings surviving in the Indian Himalaya and western Tibet, which were made in the 11th and 12th centuries by Kashmiri painters. These are the only surviving visual record of the culture of Kashmir in that period. As the paintings show, temples to the Hindu deity Balarama could also have a shrine to the Buddhist deity Green Tara. Between the 10th and the 11th centuries, one of the most magnificent temple cities of the world was built at Khajuraho, in the rule of the Chandela kings. We find here, side by side, magnificent Hindu and Jaina temples. Best of all, we find a profusion of Hindu deities made on the walls of the Jaina temples. Here again, there was no barrier between the faiths. In Gujarat, we see the same spirit of the worship of all deities. King Bhima I made a marvelous temple to Surya the sun at Modhera in the 11th century. At the same time, his wife, Udayamati, was making a beautiful step-well temple to Lord Vishnu at nearby Patan. Meanwhile, his minister, Vimala, was making a most famous Jaina temple at Mount Abu. Akbar was the greatest king of the Turco-Mongol Mughal dynasty that invaded India and ruled from the year 1526 onwards. He was an able conqueror and administrator who spread Mughal rule to many distant corners of India. He was Muslim. However, true to the spirit of the land, he did not impose his faith on the people. Some of his closest confidants, ministers, and advisors were Hindu. The artists of Akbar's court remain famous still today. 17 such painters received special titles of preeminence from the king. Of them, 13 were Hindus. In the late 16th century, Akbar created a universal faith, Deen-e-Ilahi. Hindus, Jainas, Parsis, and Christians were invited to a special house of worship. Here the beliefs of all faiths were freely discussed. Father Montserrat and Father Rudolf Aquaviva from Portugal did not understand such a spirit of free intellectual inquiry. They wrote time and again to the Pope in Rome to say that the king was about to convert. Akbar, of course, continued his equal interest in all faiths. In his rule, the Hindu epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, were translated into Persian. Magnificent illustrated manuscripts of these translations were produced by his court painters. Styles of art were created in the Mughal court which blended the best of Persian traditions with the rich indigenous heritage of India. A Mughal style was born which was unique to the subcontinent. In the medieval period, the spirit of bhakti swept through India. This was the belief in a very personal love of God. The human spirit was seen as a lover, separated from the beloved God. Worship was aimed at the desire for reunion with the divine. By the end of the 15th century, 5 sultanates had been established in the Deccan. The sultans included a descendant of the Ottoman dynasty of Istanbul and a Turkman prince who had taken refuge in India. These sultans were Shia Muslims and close allies of the Safavid rulers of Persia. In their rule, numerous Sufis came here from Persia and found a fertile ground for their ideas to flower. Both Bhakti and Sufism believed in a personalized love of God. It was a heady mixture, the ecstasy of the Bhakti movement and the mystical dreams of the Sufis.
The Sufi philosophy or the Sufi way of life was very akin to several movements that developed in India from the 14th century onwards, which are subsumed under this broad category of Bhakti movements. There is a lot of commonality in the Sufi movements and the Bhakti movements, just as Sufism borrowed quite a few ideas from the Vedanta philosophy as well.
The result was a deeply spiritual culture. Akbar's contemporary, Sultan Ibrahim Adil Shah II of Bijapur, was another great philosopher king. Though born a Muslim, he wore a necklace of Rudraksha beads in the manner of a Hindu ascetic. In his autobiography, the Sultan says that he is the son of Ganesha, the Hindu deity. Such was the heady spirit of the cosmopolitan culture of the Deccan in that time. In the meantime, the Valley of Kashmir also saw the development of a wonderful blend of Islamic Sufi traditions and earlier Buddhist and Hindu traditions. The great Kashmiri saint and poetess, Lal Ded, of the 14th century, influenced Kashmiri thought for all time to come. Hers was a message of all-embracing love. She sang, "Shiva lives everywhere. Do not divide Hindu and Muslim." Hers was a synthesis of mystical Shaivism and Islamic Sufism. She was loved by Muslims and Hindus and was known as Lal Ded, Mother Lala. Lal Ded's philosophy of love was carried forward in the valley by Sheikh Nuruddin, also known as Nand Rishi. He lives still today in the hearts and minds of both Hindus and Muslims and is known as the patron saint of Kashmir. Love for Nuruddin was not only a mystical union with God, but an active and sympathetic attitude towards all living creatures. He advocated vegetarianism and taught the equality of all living beings.
Well, I think it should be made absolutely clear that Islam in its Arab or Turkish attire did not really exist in any part of India, Kashmir included. I think Muslim societies that were developed very quickly adapted themselves to local conditions. Look at the way they recite the Holy Quran, say at the Hazrat Bal Mosque, and I have heard it at least, and it's very different from the way we recite the Quran. I suspect, and I stand corrected, that their style of recitation of the Holy Quran is very similar to the prayers of the Buddhists.
Across the whole of India, the medieval period saw the happy blend of the ideas and practices of bhakti and Sufism. This truly continued the ancient cosmopolitan traditions of India. There were poets and saints in all parts of the country, whose path of compassion was followed by persons of all faiths. As in ancient times, art, poetry, and music were found to be means for the transportation of the self, a means to elevate ourselves, to take us far from the cares and confusions of the material world, to a place of peace and oneness with the divine.
It is this desire to seek communion which leads to what is called the mystical ways or the Sufi ways. They have devised different forms. Sama, or singing, the singing of qawwalis, is one such way of seeking communion with the reality. There is also sort of distribution of food, a free distribution of food, and so on and so forth. So I think for the devotees, I think it must be a tremendous mystical experience.
गोपाल जी का मंदिर, जहाँ पन्ने का द्वार बना हुआ है और भगवान कृष्ण की थोड़ी में एक बड़ा खूबसूरत सा हीरा है, उसे लोग देखने जाते हैं दूर दूर से। लेकिन उस मंदिर में जो ज़्यादा दिलचस्प बात है वो यह है कि जब वहाँ तमाम मुस्लिम भाइयों के त्यौहार और पर्व आते हैं, मसलन मुहर्रम, अब ये शोक का दुख का पर्व है, लेकिन इसके जब ताजिए निकलते हैं तो उस मंदिर के सामने खड़े होते हैं बुर्राक, और उन बुर्राक की आरती अंदर से आती है, वहाँ से आरती उतारी जाती है, इन बुर्राक की रेवड़ी अंदर मंदिर में जाती है और लोगों में बांटी जाती है। उज्जैनी में जो महाकालेश्वर का मंदिर है, जिसके नाम से उज्जैनी को सारी दुनिया में जाना जाता है, इस मंदिर में घी के दिए जो जलाए जाते हैं वो बरसों बरस मुग़ल बादशाहों की तरफ से आते थे, और उसके प्रमाण में आज भी औरंगजेब की दी हुई सनद मौजूद है, आलमगीर की दी हुई सनद मौजूद है, जो महाकालेश्वर मंदिर में घी के दिए जलाने के लिए 4 सेर घी भेजा करते थे।
Our assessment of the past is colored by our contemporary experiences. Very often we apply our standards of judgment in assessing medieval societies. I think we should stay clear of that trap.
It's difficult to find a word in the Sanskrit vocabulary which would precisely be a synonym of the word religion as it is understood in the context of the Semitic faiths, or as the word is understood today, because dharma encompasses a much wider sort of area of human conduct, worldly and otherworldly concerns, but doesn't lay down the worship of an unwavering dedication to any particular deity.
In fact, the word Hindu did not exist in the Indian languages. It was used by the people to the northwest of India to mean those living beyond the river Indus. The phrase Hindu religion was in fact created under colonial rule as late as in the 19th century. India's is an ancient spiritual culture with a most compassionate view of the whole of creation, a vision which values the air we breathe and every plant and insect in creation. Surely there's a great deal for us to learn from this ancient culture of love for all that there is.